right now what interests me is the utter collapse of democratic government in Canada and the seeming unwillingness of people to do the most logical thing about it. And that is to demand that the Governor General, David Johnston, remove Stephen Harper from power. Now, what makes a lot of people kind of question that is, well, why should an appointed symbolic leader remove from power somebody who was elected by the Canadian public? And that question betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of Canada's political structure. And the thing of it is that the public in Canada, the electorate, does not elect the government. And that's a common misperception. Every election, the public gives its voice for the most popular party, and if the party wins a majority, then the Governor General selects the leader of that party to become the head of government. That's logical. If there should be perhaps a minority government, then the Governor General has the option to select the most popular party or someone else. Now, to say that public elects the government is incorrect, and similarly incorrect is the notion that allowing the governor or expecting the Governor General to fire the government is undemocratic. That's also false. The Governor General really is more than just an empty figurehead who merely rubber stamps the decisions of Parliament. What he has is authority granted to him by King George VI in 1947 through the letters patent establishing the office of the Governor General of Canada. And what those letters patent say is that, among other things, the Governor General may remove from office anyone for cause without qualification.
So you're saying that legally, the Governor General has the authority to fire the Prime Minister?
Not legally, constitutionally.
Constitutionally, what's the difference between legally?
Well, Constitution is the fundamental structure of Canada. It's the basic rule book by which Canada is constituted. Laws are passed by Parliament, and they represent the authority of the government to regulate society. So in other words, the Constitution supersedes anything that Parliament might pass as a form of positive law.
Okay, so you're saying constitutionally, the representative of the Queen has the right to fire the Prime Minister. But is it realistic?
Whether it's realistic or not is beside the point. It is a legitimate tactic by which Canadians can demand the return of their country to popular government. As it is now, Harper has, to all intents and purposes, overthrown the Constitution. He has subjugated Parliament to essentially an echo chamber. He is running roughshod over Parliament. He is passing prejudicial legislation that takes away the member of Parliament's right to do his or her job. There is nothing in Harper's government that is remotely Canadian in any traditional, much less conservative sense. And to look at the way Canada, under Harper, has given away our natural resources to China, has thoroughly subjugated our foreign policy to Israel, has openly violated the civil liberties of Canadians, not to mention the fact that Harper has on more than one occasion shown himself to be in utter contempt of the rule of law. So we have to ask ourselves, is it wrong for the Governor General to do something perhaps as eccentric as fire the Prime Minister?
But how feasible is it that the representative of the Queen is going to fire Mr. Harper? How realistic is it?
Well, it may not be terribly realistic, but again, if you start from the premise if something is realistic or not and don't even try, then how do you know it couldn't be done? There is a problem. David Johnston was nominated by Harper to become the Governor General. So we do have this political propinquity, which is a danger. David Johnston did Harper a service by excluding certain information from an inquiry into government shenanigans and airplane contracts that took place in the late 1980s. So David Johnston does have a very positive relationship with Harper. It is a problem. But because of that, and because David Johnston has not yet dismissed Harper, he has to be compelled to do his constitutional duty, which is why I want Canadians to recognize that they can sign a petition demanding that David Johnston dismiss the Harper government for cause, in the name of national security and the rights and welfare of Canadians. Because
Specifically, what does it mean? How has he violated the rights of Canadians?
Well, for example, Omar Khadr was arrested and tortured by the Americans unjustifiably. Of course, all torture is unjustifiable. At no time did Stephen Harper make an effort to bring him home. The rights of Canadians, for example, the Canadian citizens in this country right now have fewer rights in certain industries than do the Chinese. The Chinese up in northern British Columbia and Alberta in the tar sands are essentially creating a colony of economic exploitation. And these people have been exempt from environmental legislation. They have a locked-in deal with Canada that goes on decades. Canadians cannot object to this. Our laws, our rights have been superseded by a government that takes more pride in serving the foreign interests of foreign governments than their own people.
Yeah. More specifically, your issue is about foreign policy, and more specifically is about Israel.
Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, it's part of it. But what concerns me most is that there is no shred of constitutional integrity in this government.
What do you say about the fact that for more than 10 years the majority of Canadians did not want to have to be at war with Afghanistan, and yet the government of Mr. Harper continued to support that, our soldiers over there? Is that not one of the reasons to say that the actions of the government are completely disconnected with what the majority of Canadians want?
We have to understand that foreign policy in the Middle East is not made in Ontario, Ottawa, Toronto, or anywhere else. It's made in Israel. Because the Israelis essentially make our foreign policy. That's not a secret, that's well known. And we know that when before the Hamas government took office in Palestine, Harper colluded with three agents of the Israel lobby to oppose the Hamas election and to ostracize Hamas. So there is no real Canadian policy in the Middle East. It's all Israeli, pro-Israel, because let's not forget, Harper is an eccentric Christian who believes in some very strange theological mythologies, and he supports the notion that Israel has a right to expropriate Palestine. But of course, let us not forget that Israel is not a religious country. It's a very secular state that bears a closer similarity to many of the fascist regimes that stole land from other peoples and rationalized it after the fact.
You're saying Israel is not as religious but as secular, or?
The people who founded Israel were not truly religious Jews. They were secular Jews. A lot of the religious Jews did not want to go to Israel because they felt it was a blasphemy, because according to religious theory in Israel, the Jews are not allowed to return to the Holy Land until the prophet Elijah heralds the coming of the Messiah. Now, I'm not a religious expert and I'm not a Jew, but this is what the Bible says, and I expect that people who are very much respectful of their Jewish religion, they would adhere to this. So essentially, Israel is a living blasphemy of Judaism, and this, if you want proof of this, you should see the Jews who are of the Neturei Karta. These are the keepers, these are the holiest Jews who recognize that Israel does not have a moral or legal right to exist. And there are plenty of Jews who oppose Israel and are even prepared to go as far as to equate it with Nazi Germany.
Stephen Harper and the Liberals and the NDPs are supporters of our friendship as best friend of Israel. Canada, free trade, best friends of Canada, all parties. So what do you think about this disconnection if you run a poll and the majority of Canadians say Israel is an apartheid state and therefore we shouldn't support it, yet our government and all the political parties are supporting it? Do you see a disconnection there between our political parties, not just the leaders, but in general the parties and the population of Canada?
Well, again, the problem is the Israel lobby has its hooks into all political parties. Our entire political system is so antiquated and so corrupt that it does not even pass the basic means test of a democracy. Israelis control through, not directly, but through a lot of very sympathetic people, they control a lot of the media coverage of Canada to an obscene degree, in fact. They control a lot of the money that goes into political campaigns.
But what specifically would that be? Like, who is they when you say they control?
The Globe and Mail, the National Post, and its various subordinate papers are all pro-Israel. They're all run by people who support Israel. They censor news to support Israel. They deliberately misrepresent the Middle East by filtering out news that might cause Israel embarrassment or might otherwise cast a positive light on the Middle East, on the Arab and on the Arab states and Iran. To this day, we still listen to Barack Obama utter the patent rubbish that Syria, for example, was behind the gas attack that took place in August of this year. It wasn't. That was done by the Saudis and the so-called rebels fighting the Assad regime. But the lie still gets promulgated, still gets pumped out there. The point of the press is not to report on the Middle East, it's there to prop up a pre-established position. And Stephen Harper is fully supportive of this because he knows that it's support of Israel, corporations, arms dealers, oil companies. These are the people who put him in power. This is his true constituency. And this is why he does not really care what the Canadian public thinks, because he is not a government of the people, he is a government of plutocrats.
Mm-hmm. So are you advocating that we change government, but another government probably would do exactly the same thing because they are prone to be lobbied by the same people that the present government is being influenced by?
Well, to some degree that may be a concern, but Stephen Harper is such a thoroughgoing fascist that there could be no possible way that any government other than Harper could be any worse. Harper, as I have shown in my writing, is fascist, not just in any expletive sense, but in a literal sense, because his policies reflect that of a tyrant running a closed society on behalf of a very small hierarchical elite. If you look at Lawrence Britt's 14 Points of Fascism, which is in my book, The Host and the Parasite, you will see point by point how Stephen Harper falls into, of all the 14 points, at least 12 of them fit Harper perfectly. I'll give you an example. He has repealed the Fair Wage and Labor Act. Well, why would you appeal a Fair Wage Act that clearly benefits Canadian workers? Why would you do that unless you were there to serve corporations? And this is clearly a case where you attack labor power and you support corporate interests. You censor scientists from reporting the truth about global warming, and this is what Lawrence Britt shows as an attack upon disdain for intellectuals in the arts and a free press. Stephen Harper wants Canada to get involved in the Middle East. This is respect for militarism. What really concerns me and should concern all Canadians is Stephen Harper's threats to defund the CBC. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation came about in 1935, I believe, and has been a unifying force in Canada ever since. Under subsequent governments, it has been attacked, underfunded, vilified, and treated like an enemy of the state, simply because the CBC does not owe a prior allegiance to the interests of the government of the day. As a Crown corporation, it has an ethical responsibility and a duty to report fairly the news of the country. And the fact the CBC does criticize Harper or will criticize Israel has called into question its fitness to be a broadcaster in the eyes of Stephen Harper. And Harper is going to do his best to undermine the integrity of the CBC, almost to the point of making it beg for money. And this is why we have to remove Harper now. We need the Governor General to act now, because if we wait until 2015, there may not be anything left of this country to salvage.
Yeah.